Okay. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Benjamin Loring. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And it's my pleasure today to present a CERES alumna who will be speaking on the Russian cyber threat environment and introduction, or as she's now put it, the Russian cyber threat environment. Kimberly Zenz works as a senior threat analyst for Verisign iDefense, where she researches cybersecurity in the Russophone internet, also known as the RUNet. Her research focuses on cybercrime, specifically underground economies, cybercriminal actors, goods and services, as well as the larger trends in cybersecurity activity and broader issues related to the use of online resources in the region. She currently is based in Moscow, Russia, which we were just talking about, and also in the DC metropolitan area. And she's previously worked in the Russian Far East, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Her research has been featured in the books Fatal System Error, Spam Nation, and Cyber Fraud, Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, as well as multiple media pieces. She is a graduate of Georgetown Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies in 2004, and also the College of William and Mary. She also pursued additional study at Amur State University and the University of Vienna. Today's talk will provide an introduction to the Russian cyber threat environment, including the criminal, political, and espionage spheres, as well as the increasing overlaps between all three. So without further ado, thank you for coming, Kimberly.
Well, thank you for having me. Hi, I'm Kimberly Zenz, and I guess we'll get started. I thought I'd just do a very quick breakdown of where I'm coming from. I work for a company called Verisign. It's a multinationally publicly traded company. It's actually quite large. It has a contract with ICANN. Basically, at the top level, we manage a lot of the domains like .com, .net, .name, .cc, .tv. If you go to Google on your computer and type in google.com, we're at the top level, tell your computer how to find the actual Google servers. We also run the backend systems for .gov, .edu, and .jobs. So when you're sending your Georgetown.edu emails, we're actually maintaining some of the infrastructure at the top level. And then also we have 2 of the world's 13 root servers. We're the only people that have 2. And that's the same thing, that there are 13 of them, and they're the authoritative domain name servers which tell people how to connect from one place to another. But I actually work for iDefense, which belongs to Verisign. We're a much smaller organization. We're about 50 people. And we do cybersecurity incident response, like if clients are under attack. We do research into malware, advanced persistent threat, which is the industry term for cyberespionage, hacktivism, cybercrime, and then other related cyber threat issues. We have our headquarters in Reston. We also have an office in London. And then we have staff in Russia and China, but I am all the Russia staff. And then I have a coworker, Tom, who is all the China staff. We do have contributors that we work with on a contract basis in various countries, but I'm the entire Verisign. And our glorious office is my living room. So a very brief overview. I'll go through kind of quickly, because this is a lot to cover in so short a period of time. What's kind of going on in Russia right now, a bit about how financially motivated cybercrime works, a bit about cyber espionage, a bit about politically and personally use of online attacks. And then also, they're not individual isolated groups. They used to be treated that way by a lot of researchers, but there's been so much overlap, particularly in the RUNet. So I'm going to kind of talk a bit about that. And then a couple cases, just various examples of how these things are playing out in the real world. I'm not going to talk too much specifically about cyber war. There's still an ongoing debate about even what that entails, and that is its own completely tangential discussion. For my purposes, cyber war is actual online attacks or other activity carried out in direct support of military action, and that's not something we really do. So, all right, moving on. Kind of what's happening right now in Russia. Well, the RUNet's not only Russia, it's the Russophone internet. It's everywhere Russian is spoken online. So it's Russia, it's Ukraine, it's Belarus, it's Kazakhstan. It can be Moldova, it can be the Baltics, it can be California, it's anywhere. But from a cybercriminal perspective, it's very seamless. From a political perspective, sometimes things break down differently. Russia's kind of interesting in the way it used to be known primarily for cybercrime. Of course, there were some government espionage programs. All major governments have them, but you didn't really see it. There was some hacktivist activity, but it was typically domestic or regional. So from this country, it wasn't considered a particularly big deal. And they've been able to build on this massive cyber criminal skills base and resources base, and then expand that to improve the hacktivist side and the espionage side, which if you compare it to China, which used to be focused primarily on developing espionage skills, and then they kind of had all these people with this talent pool that they kind of got into cybercrime, it's gone in the opposite trajectory than Russia has. Very recently, the past couple years, cybersecurity has become a lot more important to the Russian leadership, which is a little troubling because, like many global leaders, they don't all fully understand the technical implications. They'll pass regulations that can't be enforced. They have concerns that are difficult to address. It kind of started with the 2012 opposition protests in Russia. A lot of that, I'm sure as you all will know, organized online. Got a lot of government interest in getting control. Maidan as well, conflict in East Ukraine, tensions with the West. All of that is pushing both the things you see in the press about the government wanting to have larger control over internet content, but also things like a desire to have import substitution, which is basically having Russian-owned companies that produce the software and hardware that the government uses, and not just Russian-owned, wholly Russian-owned by trusted businessmen. Which is why things like the VKontakte social network, it was Russian-owned, but now it's still Russian-owned just by trusted Russians. And then also you'll see things like unofficial pressures. Putin has made some hints, particularly at Yandex, about how they could possibly get more in line. There's no laws, there's no regulations. It's just, they really are, they get the message that they need to be cooperating without formal action. And then also you see a lot more activity abroad. Information warfare, do you guys know about that? I see some yeses, but basically that's their favorite term. I actually like their approach better than the US dividing cyber war and all these different silos. It's the control of the information space. It's communications, it's public diplomacy, it's attacks, it's security. They really are a holistic whole, so I think that's actually right. But that's something that they're really quite focused on. And you do see that transferring over into the online sphere as well. And then the internal and external enemies issues is domestically they're concerned about opposition, they're concerned about influence from abroad, also depending on how you define abroad, there's the issues related to Ukraine and all the follow-on international issues. And these are all things they always worried about, but have now become a lot more important. So moving on to financially motivated cybercrime. This is what I do more than anything else. This is what I absolutely love. It is really the key source of Russia's cyber capabilities. There are multiple forums, underground, legitimate educational opportunities, lots of groups. It's very friendly, it's very open. If there's something you want to learn, there's a way for you can do it. It's also very diverse. There are underground forums, which is probably what gets the most attention, and they are just sites for the sale of goods and services to criminals. And they range in what they sell, they range in how difficult it is to get onto them. But these are markets that allow for the development of diverse skills and different providers of goods and services at every stage of the transaction chain. It also just has services where people just do everything for you. And by that I mean, here for example, I could write a banking Trojan, which is a piece of malware that allows me to take control of victims' computers, record their credentials as they log into a bank. It could also do things like actually transfer money out at that moment and then show the victim that like $50 has been sent to pay their bill, but actually $5,000 has been sent to me. It could send me an immediate alert. It could automate, all these processes, or I could just write it and sell it to someone else who doesn't know how to write it but wants one. They just buy it. And then they could infect victims, or they could pay someone else who would infect them either by sending spam, using networks of computers that they already own and control, or they could also infect websites, do it the same way, or you could just pay for already infected computers. You can buy or rent, by the hour even, networks of infected computers and servers called botnets to do whatever you need to do with them. You can also just pay someone with a botnet to do it for you. Once you have your credentials, you could also just pay someone else to monetize them. The really good monetized guys are called cash out experts. They charge 60%, but then they just do it all for you and your money just appears in an account somewhere. The other option you could use is malware as a service, it's essentially you pay a monthly subscription fee. You go online, you say, you get your little drop-down menus. I want to target these organizations. I want these countries, so many infections, and you just pay. And that's it. You have very little to do. You can pay a little extra if you want something specific. You could also be one of these guys and then pay like a little programmer to write a plugin for you, just every level. And of course, at the end of the day, all these guys are criminals, so they could be robbing you. If they're selling you credentials that they say they've stolen to banks or credit cards, they could be wrong. So then you go to a third person, essentially credit rating service, who will verify that these credentials are valid and reimburse you as you need and things like that. Really, it's an economy first. It's illegal only in that it's against the law, it involves victims, but most of them aren't particularly concerned about law enforcement action. That's another problem worldwide, is getting capacity for addressing all this stuff. The risk is very low, and the return on investment is very high because most of the time they're using stolen infrastructure. So if they're using other people's equipment and other people's connection bandwidth, then it's not very expensive, even if you're paying other criminals for the right to use them. And it's increasingly diffuse. It used to be a lot of these groups were really central. You'd have a hosting provider or a money launderer, and they would have physical locations. They'd have servers that you would know were theirs, which was great because you could just take those, every IP address and block it. Done. Put them on your blacklist. Or there'd be financial services. They would actually have their own virtual currency, and they would have accounts at banks that were laundering the money. And then if you wanted to stop them, you could just go there and arrest them. And they're getting increasingly diffuse to make that more difficult. They're getting more diffuse in their infrastructure, and they're getting more diffuse in their organizational structures, which is something that was developed for cybercrime, but all the other type of actors are really happy to use the same services that are being pitched to cybercriminals to hide their own activities. And it's organized sort of the way that most communities are. There's about 80% small guys, 20% making possibly even tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're a smaller number, but they're causing most of the damage. They're the groups that I really focus on. I'm not trying to get some Carter and Omsk arrested. And those guys often have organized crime connections or corrupt protection connections, or there was one, actually, the guy's uncle was in the Interior Ministry. All right. In terms of cyber espionage, this I actually do the least, so I will go over it a bit, but it's all stuff that I get from open source. It's not my research. Our company does do cyber espionage, but it's more like if our clients, which are mostly financial institutions or just companies that are so large they worry about their networks, if they're actually targeted, then we'll investigate it, try to figure out what happened, try to figure out how to protect themselves. I don't go to Russia and go to the FSB and ask to talk about their cyber espionage programs. I don't think that would get me very far. But you have those same traditional targets that you would expect, which is government, military, quangos, NGOs. But one thing that we're actually seeing a lot more of than the media really covers is technology. They talk about it with China a lot, about industrial espionage, but they don't talk about it so much with Russia. And it's definitely there. There always was a need for certain technologies for the military, but the current political situation has really promoted this idea of import substitution, of making everything Russian, of not depending on Western organizations. And so they're trying very hard to get a huge range of things very quickly. There's a law that says the government has to have only all Russian software in 7 years. There's initiatives in the military to try to develop a Russian alternative to chips and other things like that. And so therefore the range of people that can be targeted has gotten a lot broader. I mean, there's government programs right now. They've been trying to develop an alternative operating system since at least 2006. It hasn't worked. They tried developing an alternative search engine that didn't really take. They tried alternative Twitter that didn't really take. Now they're going to try to do Skype as well. They've actually hired the company who did the search engine to try to make Skype or a new VoIP service. So those are the kind of things that people are starting to get worried they might be targeted, just as in China that's happened, because they have a value. It's not just the Pentagon, things like that. And the increased pressures to get all this information is leading to increased activity. In the past, I've actually heard the Russian security profile defined as paranoid. I feel like it's not actually paranoid if people are out to get you, but they're very concerned about security. And they had smaller programs that were more about quality than quantity. So unlike China, where they'll have government espionage programs, contractors working for the government, people doing it on spec with the idea that if I find something, then I'll sell it to the government, but we haven't actually talked about this yet. There was this large number of actors, so it was a lot easier to find them, particularly the smaller guys who weren't that good. In China, or in Russia, you had a lot less noticed instances just because the quality of the work was so good, you weren't catching it. And also there's less of it. Now, because the pressure is on to ramp up operations so much, you do see people making more mistakes, and you are catching it more. Also, when people do find out that they're compromised because of the political situation, they're more willing to go public about it, which was something in the past they just want to not discuss it, not be in any reports, and now they will. But it is important to note also, not everything from Russia is Russian, just not like everything from China is Chinese. They have networks, they are available to sale and rent, People go through them from other countries all the time. If you trace something back to Russia, it doesn't mean it was done in Russia. It might have been China, might have been Moldova, I don't know. Might have been France. If you trace it back to China, it might be Russian, you don't know. Where is this? It is not working. I'm pushing as hard as I can. There we go. Hacktivism is defined as just online attacks for political or personal purposes. It comes from hacking and activism, but the range of activities that are now hacktivism has expanded significantly past what you would just call activism. You would once upon a time think it was mostly private individuals acting out for a certain cause, be it an anti-government cause, be it your friend was arrested for marijuana possession and you want to punish the local police station, anything like that. But now, in addition to having these very politically motivated activities, you'll have state operations involved in false flag things, try to make it look like it's hacktivist, and then you'll just have pro-state actors or anti-state actors, but they're motivated personally, but for political reasons. And it can be very difficult to try to really work out who's behind certain things, especially when everyone is claiming to be part of an independent movement, motivated purely by love of whatever good cause it is today. It also is now, it used to be pretty domestic, and that was true anywhere. Like, hacktivists in America would go after American targets. Hacktivists in Russia would go after Russian targets. Maybe a Ukrainian target or something like that, but it would not be international. Now you find international actors can be targets. And the two examples I have mentioned here, NATO I will get to in the little case study section, but there were US-based and Germany-based video streaming services that were showing protests in Russia, anti-government protests, and they came under attack. That used to never happen. Also, you see things on the official side, proposed plans to actually alter how the Russian internet is structured, so if you don't want to attack a site, you can actually cut it off. And techniques can vary. The oldest one is probably defacement. That just means compromising a site and changing what it says. Some of them are quite sophisticated. They make it look like the original site, but they put on a message that is either defamatory, for example, Russian, like Dmitry Yarov's party, like they're trying to say he's a fascist, so someone compromised his website and put up, Nazi iconography and things like that, or his party's website rather. It could be just, I have hacked your site and you're dumb. It could be a song, it could be anything you want. Those are basically out of fashion in the Runet until people got interested in doing some of those like disinformation things. So, they also did things like they compromised social networks and made people post things that they haven't said. And you've actually seen that not just with pure hacktivism, you've also seen it with things like Russian officials had posted that they're resigning when they're not really resigning, things like that. Part of internal infighting. And then DDoS attacks is still, I'd say, definitely the most common. That stands for distributed denial of service attack. What that means is you have a network of computers or servers that just, I guess the simplest way, is just overload a target with information so they can't function. And that could be a website or a network or whatever. You can also do that with phones. You can use VoIP to call a cell phone over and over and over, so you just can't use it. That happens at election day in Russia and Ukraine. And although there's not one person that can claim to have invented the DDoS attack, I've met a couple people who have claimed to have invented the DDoS attack, and that is, Russia is a major center, and the Runet is a major center for botnet and DDoS activity. There are a lot of people there who really know what they're doing. Although interestingly, Ukraine does too, thanks to the Runet. It's one of the few places where Ukraine and Russia are actually, roughly, they have similar capabilities in a lot of ways. So when you've got patriotic Russians or patriotic Ukrainians attacking each other, it's a very different sphere than if they're doing it on the ground with tanks. Data breaches is another one that's gotten quite popular, which I find that's my favorite. I think is the most interesting. The idea is just to compromise a target and show that you've done it. Sometimes that's enough. If you want to, say, compromise Privatbank, a Ukrainian bank owned by an oligarch particularly disliked by some Russians, you could get the account, this actually happened, you could get the account information of high value accounts and post them online just to say they're insecure, to damage their reputation. You could also do things like target politicians or groups and say, this is the email correspondence showing they're taking funding from the United States, they're actually traitors. Or you could make it up. You could actually steal their emails and then add in additional false information, or you can fake it entirely. You could just take information from somewhere else and say, oh, I stole it from these guys, I hacked them, look how awful they are. And all that's happening. And this goes into blurring the lines between the spheres. You'll see things like cyber criminal actors, good service, they end up in espionage or hacktivist incidents. Depending on the incident, how they got involved can vary. They could just be hired. I mean, I've seen posts online like, I'm collecting money to hire a botnet to target this particular Ukrainian site, donate now. They could be pressured. There are really, despite you say there's so much activity in Russia, there are actually not that many bot herders. Like if the government really wanted to find all of them, they could, and then be like, so we know who you are, do this. Or the local people could do that as well. And then there's also, just because you're a criminal on one sphere doesn't mean you don't actually have opinions about politics on the other. So you'll have people who are voluntarily, sending spam one day, and then the next day they're using their same networks to target sites that they personally have a problem with. Excuse me. And then also you'll see things like espionage, like hiding behind the mask of cybercrime. For if you use, say, a sophisticated operation where you're using your own custom-written exploits, when a company that's been targeted or a government organization that's been targeted finds that, they'll know what's happened to them. If you use a banking Trojan, because all that really does is allow you to get control of a system to install what you want, and you can even hire, some of these are customizable. You just use your drop-down menus to choose exactly what you want it to be doing. You can do that, and when it may not be as sophisticated, it may not be quite as effective, but when your target finds it, they'll just think, oh no, we've been inadvertently targeted by this banking Trojan, it's not a big deal, we don't have to worry about it. So it's a little safer on the other side. You see that happening. Or you see hacktivists on their own, like they're just personally motivated, they're trying to spy on other governments and things, or other targets. And then you also see kind of mixes like, I will steal these financial credentials, but I won't do it because I want to make money. I'll do it because I'll leak it, in the case of Privatbank, to make it look bad. So it's up until that point, it sort of seemed like it would count as cybercrime, but then what they did with it sort of blended it over. And some examples, there was a case in Russia of, I think almost 10 million, I could be misremembering, email credentials appearing online. This is the summer. They were from Google, Mail.ru, and Yandex. But of the Google ones, the majority of them were Russian. And they sort of appeared online, and their immediate source was not particularly clear, but a lot of the discussion was about how this shows that they're insecure. And parliamentarian actually flat out came and said, this shows that they're insecure, we should be regulating. This is at the time, there's a law, pending law in Russia that's quite controversial, that discusses whether or not, or I guess it requires, that the personal data of Russians only be stored in Russia. So like you can't have a Facebook account and have it stored in America. You can't use Booking.com, things like that. And this was used as evidence. Look, this is what happens when you trust your credentials with outsiders. They lose them. However, further investigation showed that the majority of the accounts that were in there were either from old breaches that the companies knew about from a long time ago, or were automatically generated. They were never used by anyone. They were just done to boost the number because 5 million is scarier than 2 and 10 million is scarier than 5. And so there was some conjecture, with all these, of course, true attribution is close to impossible, but there's some conjecture that this is actually just created to make it look like these groups are insecure to support promotions that they be secure. The banking espionage, I actually just mentioned that, but there's a specific case, Citadel. It's a very well-known banking Trojan, but it was used, it's available to anyone online who wants to use it, but it was available, it was found to be espionage programs targeting Scandinavia, Spain, Japan, other organizations, trade organizations, things like that. And then forced DDoS, I kind of mentioned that, like people being told like, you have a choice, you can be prosecuted or you can do this. But there's also been cases of cyber criminals blackmailing each other, like, I know who you are now, help me out. And then this whole problems with Ukraine, they're incredibly distressing, but they're also an opportunity for all these actors to really expand the scope of their operations, because there's all these new target sets and there's all these new ways of interfering with the flow of information beyond just I will take their website down or I will steal their money. And so it's sort of seen this real flowering of, I guess, creativity, you can almost call it, in all the different spheres because of it, although I'd be much happier if it just ended. And a couple examples. First I'll start with a picture, because that's on the right is Pablo Tuscan. He was a cyber criminal for many years, then he went to jail, now he's out and is rumored to be working on a government project. And then that is Minister Ivanov to his left at a basketball game. But I'm not implying that Ivanov was knew at that point in time who he was hanging out with, but probably does now. Anyway, first example is just pure financial cybercrime. It's a banking Trojan called Dira. They're a closed operation. They're not for sale. They're doing it themselves. They're really aggressive. Every couple days they're changing their malware just a little bit so it can't get caught by antivirus. They target new banks in new countries because, like a Turkish bank may not even be aware of them versus, say, like an American bank is. So once the American banks are very aware and they're increasing security, just move on to the Turks. It's easier than combating the Americans, things like that. Espionage, actually, I did mention Citadel already. And then false flag hacktivism. These are two interesting cases. One, shortly after Visa and MasterCard blocked processing payments for two banks owned by people on the sanctions list in Russia, a group calling themselves Anonymous Ukraine, pushing for an independent Ukraine of Russia and the EU and the US, posted what they said were 7 million credit card numbers and details that they had stolen directly from hacking Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover in retaliation for this cutoff. It made the news. It looked quite scary. If you looked at the database, you just popped it open, it's 7 million credit card numbers. Not everyone looked at all 7 million. The first few looked legitimate and new. And they were, but the vast majority of them were very old, like from 2007. They do exist. They were for sale on the criminal underground for very cheap. Someone just bought them, bought a few new ones, put them on the top so it looks good, put it online, and a lot of media just picked up 7 million credit cards. They didn't do the back cert, they didn't do the back research. A lot of people who saw the first story didn't see the follow-up story 3 days later, and it looked really bad. But actually nothing happened. And Visa and MasterCard and American Express were never compromised at all. It was just entirely made up. And then the NATO and Ukrainian election attacks, those are kind of interesting ones. The NATO one happened, there was an exercise last fall called Steadfast Jazz in the Baltics, and Russia was quite unhappy about this. They did not, y'all know about Russia and NATO. And around that time, two things happened. One, a group calling itself Anonymous Ukraine, asking for an independent Ukraine of both Russia and the West, was sending emails to the media about this particular problem and launching DDoS attacks. They targeted some Baltics military sites and things like that, all affiliated with that particular campaign. At the same time, some businesses in the area received emails claiming to be from NATO, saying, we are NATO. As part of this exercise, we have actually hacked your business and found you to be insecure. Some even had their websites defaced with a message that said NATO has defaced this website because it's insecure. Now, NATO actually doesn't do that as part of their military exercises. Although they do have a cybersecurity division, it doesn't do that. But the idea was to get people thinking that NATO was doing that and to make them look really bad. What's interesting about that is the emails that said we are NATO came from the same IP address as the emails that said we are United or Anonymous Ukraine. And it was actually an ISP in Georgia, which goes back to just because something's coming from one country doesn't really mean you know exactly who's doing it. But so it does not appear to actually have been NATO targeting, but it was kind of some hacking to make them look bad that would technically be hacktivism, but also political stuff. And then the Ukrainian elections well, there's a lot going on. This is about the presidential elections last May. A lot of politicians, particularly, the big politicians, not a lot, had the VoIP DDoS attacks where basically their mobile phones were called so much on election day they became useless. There were claims. One group said they attacked more than 500 websites, related government websites, although the 500 did not go down. But the most interesting was the Ukrainian government said that they had discovered they had been compromised, and they had found, before it happened, they found an operation to replace about 40 minutes before it was supposed to happen, to replace the actual voting results, which had Poroshenko, who won, running first, and then Dmitry Yarov, he is pretty actually far right. In Russia, he's described as kind of like the leading fascist. He in reality, he got less than 1% of the vote. This particular screenshot was 37% of the vote he had. And about 40 minutes before it was supposed to happen, they discovered this, and it didn't happen, and just showed the legitimate results. What's interesting about this is First Channel, the Russian state-owned media channel, reported that the elections site was showing 37% for Dmitry Yarosh, and the screenshot that they showed was the one that never actually showed on the actual elections commission site. So the Ukrainians have accused the Russian government of being behind it. Again, connection is not guaranteed causation, but that's what that was. The same thing with the NATO one. The Baltics accused Russia of being behind it, but again, it's hard to say. What you can say about the NATO one is some Russian media, including like RIA Novosti, they published that NATO had actually done these attacks. They'd actually compromised too, and that has not been corrected last I checked. And then now we get back to Pasha, who's like my favorite cyber criminal. He did everything. He started off actually in violent pornography, which is somewhat unpleasant. But he had problems finding credit card payments processors who would process payments for him. So he started his own payments processor, then got into doing it for cyber criminals who need, say, like, they do like Rogue AV, which is Rogue Antivirus. They claim you have a virus and you have to give them $80 to remove it, but they're the ones that have infected you, things like that. But you need to take a credit card to look legitimate, so he would process those payments. He had a whole actually operation. It's almost like Mary Kay. They help you, like, you get like a little franchise, you get templates, you get advertising support. You just got to set it up and bring customers for drugs, like pharmaceutical sales, and he would process payments for that. He had his own currency. He had an electronic currency. He did money laundering services. He, according to his business rival, who he hates him, so may not be telling the truth, he actually had a business partner who was married to one of Yeltsin's grandchildren, who got involved with the money laundering aspect and then stole it all, essentially. So then he went back to payments processing. He found new business partners, including a mobster from one of the Brotherhoods who's wanted for murder in Spain, and another completely unrelated cyber criminal company in Estonia, which just saw that it would be really great to have a criminal payments processor, so they invested in their operation, bought 25%. Actually, that guy he was arrested. He was just the head of that company. He was just extradited to New York. But so he was doing all that. He had a lot of other side operations, but he still had this legitimate front business. He claimed to be a legitimate payments processor. If I wanted to pay my power bill in Russia online, I would have done it through him. If I wanted to give a donation to the World Wildlife Foundation, I would have done it through him. And he had this white operation to hide the black. The problem was he wanted the business for his white operation, and he wanted Aeroflot specifically as a customer. So in order to do this, well, first of all, he put the wife of one of the Aeroflot people involved in the deal on his payroll, but he DDoSed the competitor who had the contract at that moment, which took the competitor offline for a week, which meant the 1,000 companies that do business with this competitor, including Aeroflot, could not process payments online. They just couldn't buy or sell anything, which got law enforcement attention finally. He was arrested. He was made to quit the government committees that he was on. He was on the anti-spam committee and on the Duma's e-commerce and security committee. He had to quit those. And ultimately he was arrested and he went to jail. And he was sentenced to a little bit more than 2 years, but halfway through he got out. And the rumor has it that he's actually been hired to work for the new government payments processor, which is that's real, that does exist. That is, originally was supposed to be an entity to be completely separate of Visa and MasterCard to protect Russia from the fact that Visa and MasterCard could just cut off payments. Now they're actually looking about maybe making Visa and MasterCard work through this payments processor, but the story has it that he is actually very good at hiding transactions that he wants to. He had convinced Verisign, he had convinced Visa that he was at their events, like he convinced them he was a legitimate customer. So he's there. A journalist actually called him and asked him and said if it's true, and he said, all I can say is I was given an offer I can't refuse, and I'm busy. So that's what I said. That's it. Questions?
Sorry, what was his name again?
Vriblevsky. I call him Pasha because Pablo Vriblevsky is difficult for me to say. Vrublevsky. Yes. He's pretty well known.
I'm going to use my position as moderator to ask the first question, which is a little bit sort of a takeoff from your presentation. Can you just tell us a little bit about your career path from after the School of Foreign Service and how you got into this work?
Okay. I'm sort of like the Forrest Gump of cybercrime. I kind of fell into it. Actually, when I was at Georgetown, I had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan, which was January 2002. So I went. Actually, I missed classes here. I had to write papers and things while I was there to make up for it. The professor was actually pretty supportive. And so I was doing that for a little bit, and I graduated and was doing that. Then I went. It was infrastructure development, unrelated to anything. It was just, I'd never been. I wanted to see it. So I was doing that. I was doing a lot of the pilots there at Tajik who speak Russian. So I was doing kind of like some flight management, seeing the country. It was very different then. You could do that. And then I got a job at what was then called Jane's Information Group, which is, it does media and research and consulting for generally regular security stuff. And I was doing Russia. I was doing kind of more, we'd say, like traditional policy, and I kind of got a bit into organized crime. And now, when I was an undergrad, I used to do graphic design. And this is always just a hobby. Like if my club needed a poster, I would make it. If I wanted to buy boots that my mother wouldn't pay for, I would make a flyer somewhere and get my boots. Like it was not serious. But as cybersecurity became trendy, they were kind of like, well, you know about computers, you should be looking at that too. But because it's the exact same thing as cybercrime, as graphics design. And so it was sort of like I remember like the first time they told me about phishing, I was like, oh, that's such a cute word. And now it's, it like costs like billions of dollars. It's not cute. But anyway, so I was sort of doing that, but I was also going back and forward to Afghanistan. And then things got really bad in Afghanistan, and a lot happened, and I wanted to leave. And I actually found iDefense through Georgetown. Someone else who previously graduated from the security studies program was already there. And I went to go work for them. And I said in the interview for the position I had then, I have to ask this. I don't feel like I'm qualified for the job. Like, some of the things you're describing, I don't know how to do. And they replied, we've been looking for someone for this position for 6 months. We cannot find them. We think they don't exist. At this point, we're looking for someone who can learn some of it and has enough of a basis to learn the rest. And they wanted someone, we have people who focus on each region, so they wanted someone who could go to Russia and focus on Russia. And I knew a lot about the security environment, I knew about the policy, I knew a little bit about cybercrime, and so I worked there for 4 days and they sent me to Russia. And that at the time I was quite concerned about this, but it ended up being really useful. They told me a few people to talk to first, they sent me to a conference, and people there would say, what are you doing? And I said, I don't know, I've only been working here for 4 days. What should I be doing? And they were really nice. Now I'm expected to know what I'm talking about. Now I'm expected to be professional. I can't go to events and say I don't know what I'm doing. Someone else tell me how to do my job. But back then it was really useful for developing my networks, developing my contacts. And then I built the program there. I was just supposed to be there for a few weeks, but I went for 3 months. I went for 6 months. I bought a place. And I just really, everything that I do is based on my network there. I was asked what's in a conference, like what are my most popular tools? And I said, really, number one, just ask nicely. Is to work. There's a lot of really amazing talent there and really great people who are very dedicated and very skilled and know a lot more about all of this than anyone in the US could just because of where they are. And I work with them. I have contributors that I pay. I have people who I just work with, like we help each other out or we help each other out. There are people there, particularly in the cybercrime field. I mean, these are Russians in Russia breaking Russian law. They're also against that. So if they can help, they will. And I just built my network out from there. And then I guess that's the short version. I used to do a lot of conferences and media just because that was my company, that was their strategy, they've now changed. So I built some of my partnerships through that as well. And but I guess the real answer for someone like in y'all's position would be more, you have to have some sort of a grounding. No one expects or even wants true technical understanding. Like I would never, even now, I would never say like reverse malware and tell you how exactly it works. There are people who do that better, who have different educations, and they would be silly to ask me. I read the report when it's done, but I didn't even know how to do that when I started. I showed, I have a really, a good contextual knowledge of what's happening in Russia, how it affects the major internet stuff, policy, regulation, some of the crime issues. There's this big debate in Russia now about, should we crack down on them, should we support them, things like that. And also be really flexible, because they're like, if we work for you, if we hire you, we're going to send you to Russia, and you're going to have to just sort of figure it out. And I say yes to everything for 2 years. I just had to say yes. I didn't mind because I love Russia and I was just really glad to do it, but it was not an option. You just had to do it all.
Yeah. All right, I'll let you field any additional questions.
Yes?
How does Bitcoin and sort of cryptocurrency factor in some of what you mentioned, this guy who's trying to set up a payment system and he said currency. I don't know what year he was operating in, but maybe with the explosion of Bitcoin and all these imitators.
Well, Bitcoin does exist. Cybercriminals are using it because it is anonymous. It's not the only one. This guy actually, he was popular for a while, but he was more of a money laundering service for the really big guys. The minimum account was $10,000, but a lot of them had a couple, hundreds of thousands or even millions. I think he lost $22 million when it got raided. That's hard to say because it's adding up what people publicly said they lost online, which isn't entirely verifiable. But it's not just Bitcoin. Bitcoin is definitely there, but web money is used a lot. Web money is an electronic currency that is quite popular in Russia. I use web money, I use it to pay for things online all the time. They're kiosks. You can put cash in the kiosk and get a web money balance that way. And it actually started off being very popular with just cyber criminals, but banking is quite expensive for small and medium-sized enterprises there. I mean, just things like escrow cost a lot. If you want to take cash out, you have to pay 5%, things like that. So they started using web money. And by the time the government became aware of it and tried to regulate it, they had opposition from all these legitimate businesses that were using it. But cyber criminals still were. Now web money has a reputation for sometimes working with law enforcement, but many cyber criminals still take it. There was another one, Liberty Reserve, which was just for criminals. They were actually Russian nationals who took well, not only Russian, but they were run by a Russian who took Costa Rican nationality and was running it out of Costa Rica. They were actually shut down by the US government. It's estimated they laundered about $6 billion in various, mostly cybercrime proceeds before that happened. So they were quite popular. Now you do see web money, you see Bitcoin, you see some other electronic currencies, smaller versions of web money, like perfect money and things. They're sort of like less, they claim they're safer. They'll do things too. You can get like an ATM card in any name that you can withdraw money from. With Bitcoin, you can do, but it's harder. And then on the Bitcoin side, you see laundering issues because Bitcoin itself is anonymous, but if you're transferring that money into like dollars, for example, you have to go through an exchange. So theoretically, law enforcement could go to that exchange and then find you from there. So they do things like what they call tumbling, which is a lot of people will put Bitcoins together in one pool and then they all get cash on the other and you can't see exactly who is connecting through. The challenge with that, though, and this is the limit on Bitcoin still, for the really big guys, the guys who got $40 million to launder, they can't do that because Bitcoin is not big enough. If there's like one person putting $40 billion into a Bitcoin tumbling operation, and there's only one person taking $40 million out on the other side, you know who it was. So they are getting more sophisticated, they are getting better, but like they divide it, they do different things, but that still remains a challenge. Yes?
Hi, I lived in Estonia a few years ago, and one of the things that Estonians are especially fond of talking about was the big cyber attack that had been enacted against them in 2006. And Estonians really like to blame the Russian government. The Russian government says it wasn't. What is proven? What is suspected? What was that situation?
That one, I would say, if there was Russian government involvement, they weren't the central force of it. There's been some other attacks the Russian government has been accused of getting involved in, Georgia, for example, where I think there's stronger connections to state involvement. It's not saying there's no one involved. It was an ongoing attacks over multiple days. So, and there were some organizers. Basically, the way the argument breaks down is it took multiple days to the attack to reach its greatest height, which suggests building force. It's not something that was ready, and they just did it. And more people getting involved. You also, another issue was there were some organizers. There were people saying like, everyone now attack this target, and they'd be shifting very fast, like in a minute or two sometimes. So there were some organizers, and that's where Estonians like to point and say it was the government. It may not have been the government. There may have been people who were involved. I know people in Russia who were involved in that for patriotic reasons. I actually read one I know in a grocery store right after that happened, and I had it in my cart, Estonian butter, and he took it out of the cart, threw it back in the dairy counter. I was like, we don't buy this trash. And then proceeded to tell me everything he was doing about, and he's purely personally motivated, and he's very skilled, and he's, in the industry. So while I wouldn't rule out, there were organizers, there was someone, but it took them a few days to come to the party, and it took them a few days to really get their organization together. It's genuine. Also, the reason it started was there was like riots in Estonia. That was not by the government. That was actually ethnic Russians in Estonia who were unhappy. And that played very well in Russia. That got Russians very unhappy already. So I think there's enough genuine grievance. If you go to Georgia, where, well, there are a lot of people in Russia with strong feelings about Georgia, the attacks happened like the moment the war started, and and they were at maximum capacity. That suggests a stronger organizing center. In the Estonia case, it's a lot more opaque. Although Estonia has certainly managed to build a lot on that case. It's been really beneficial for them. Yes?
Hi, first, thank you for coming to this presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I'm interested in the demographics of the cybercriminal underground. In particular, what their backgrounds are, who they are, their education, and also if there's a connection to a concept that's come across in books about Russian history, even going back to the 19th century, which is the concept of thieves. The word I don't know the original Russian word, but in English they use thief. Thief as a profession, the code of the thief, the thief skills.
Well, I know what you're talking about. There's the whole like thief in law thing. That's basically dead. The 90s killed that. That was a Soviet thing. It had very strict rules. I know a guy who claims to know a thief in law, who, like a real one, from the Soviet era. Now I'm reporting. I mean, totally unrelated to cybercrime. And basically, one of the things you can't do is you can't make money if in that code, like from business. And a lot of these guys have no problem with that. A lot of the 90s kind of seem to have killed that. It exists on some level, but not the way it did. There are some codes, but I would say they're more like best business practices than codes. They used to say we won't drain accounts of less than $1,000 because people with less than $1,000 in an account really can't afford to miss it even for a couple days before the bank puts it back. That's completely gone. I actually think that was more talk than actual practice, but they stopped talking like that. Now, actually, instead what they do is they divide the accounts they have by value and they sell them to other people. So they sell the $1,000 less accounts for less money, sometimes to Nigerians, sometimes to local people, and then like they keep the higher value ones themselves. And that's really the only like code. There's also, well, there's the code of not getting involved in child pornography. A lot of them specifically say that because, I mean, they have a problem with that too. Although there was one big operation where one of the main leaders was a pedophile, so he was okay with it. Sometimes they don't target certain things. That's when I know I've done a good job, when I see like don't target Verisign. Like, so you'll see that thing, but mostly they're just in it for the money. They're the codes they operate. If you're a ripper, like if you're lying and you're selling bad goods, you'll be labeled as such and be kind of recorded as such. You should obviously not cooperate with law enforcement. You should be professional. You know, things like that. Not really. A lot of things are actually taken, a lot of steps are taken to avoid cheating. You've had like automatic exchanges for the sale mostly of like things that can be commodified. So automatic exchanges for the sale of infected computers or the rent or credit card numbers. They're purely automated. They work entirely on market forces by supply and demand, which makes it harder for people to feel like they're being cheated. It's also a lot more efficient for the sellers. They can conduct multiple transactions at once. So things like that you'll see, but like basically don't get scammed by the scammers. But really code, no. In terms of demographics, you have to speak Russian. I would imagine based on demography in general, there's probably like a large number of Russians involved. I've heard accusations that Ukrainians are actually disproportionately the most likely to engage in cybercrime, but I'm not sure how on earth someone would have a valid statistic for that. It seems possible, but I don't know. In terms of how they get educated, there's lots of opportunities. There are technical schools and universities. There are also a lot of like friendly groups. Like, okay, I'm in the biggest one, but there are multiple groups you can get together, like in person or online. There's training. There's classes. There's, you know, if you want to learn in Russia, you can. There are many ways of doing it. And then how like the small guys get into it, they tend to be like one or two people that figure it out, you know. And they get a little bigger, they need to start laundering money, they start hiring other services. A little bigger than that, there's actually an academic in St. Petersburg, I wish I could remember his name, but he did this really interesting paper on how they get involved with organized crime. And it basically hits the point where they start really needing protection from their money laundering aspects. Or outside, when they are paying for protection, and organized crime wants to get into cybercrime. So they like basically find out about it through the protection contract and co-opt them. They can also be hired. I've had a friend who's very good cybersecurity researcher who's been offered a job by one of the people he was investigating. So he turned it down, but like people say, I mean, it was like 5 times his monthly salary. So, you know, some people will say yes to that. You know, they kind of get into it different ways. The really big guys, they tend to be like any business. They find some special niche and really drive it. And that's something that they can do. Either they don't have to be good at programming, although many of them are, but they bring something to the operation. The really big ones also tend to be divided. There's like different people who do different things. Like I can be really good at forging certificates, and that's all I do. You know, things like that. Yes?
I'm wondering if you have any numbers for financial institutions that actually had to pay back. For example, I was hit by the Target scam here. I didn't see anything that Target, or more precisely the banks. I'm with SunTrust Bank.
Yeah.
They sent me a new debit card. They've got the expense there. They sent me the debit card. But I didn't see anything related to their financial statements that they actually had to put money back because money was stolen from the account.
They typically, financial institutions assume 2 to 3% losses to fraud as a cost of doing business. And they wouldn't put any smaller line items. Anything more than that, they get nervous. Anything at that level, I mean, I don't say they're okay with it. They obviously strongly dislike it, but they just accept that that's what's going to happen to them. So that's probably written off somewhere in their financial statements as some extraneous cost.
That's my point.
Yeah.
Everybody's making such a fuss. I see lawyers and so on
Well,
making-
Target, for starters, a lot of fraudulent charges were made with credit cards or debit cards taken through Target, and the merchants where the charges are made, they eat the cost. So if I get a stolen credit card and I go to the electronics store and buy a bunch of TVs, or I do it online, that I'm going to send to Poland, to drive to Ukraine, to sell in a market in Kiev, the electronics store eats the cost. They just do a chargeback, and that's their loss. So that's very diffuse. It's wherever the cards were used. There are, of course, the legal fees, the security fees, reputational damage, and all that, the replacement card fees. But the real costs are going to be to the merchants, and that's not going to be one line item. I also imagine, although certainly debit cards are used at Target, there's a lot of banks in America. America is really diverse when it comes to like banks per capita. So individual ones, it wouldn't be so significant compared to their normal fraud losses that they're already encountering. And that's actually, you sort of touched upon why sometimes calculating damages can be very difficult. Is it just money stolen? Is it lost time? Is it legal issues? How do you know every merchant everywhere what they've cost? Not everyone's reporting. Getting effective cybercrime statistics in terms of damaging is very difficult. Yes?
This is probably, I guess, more of a personal question, I guess. What is your take on kaspersky and state involvement? I'm guessing with Verisign has to work closely with district.
We don't work closely. I work closely with Kaspersky. I have some people there that I personally really like, and an ex-boyfriend. But like, no, I think their investigations team is professional and amazing. There are accusations against Kaspersky. The people I see, they're the investigations. They're investigating fraud in Russia, and they're doing it quite seriously. There's been some accusations like, oh, they're antivirus. In fact, the Ukrainian government said their antivirus is letting Russian spies through deliberately. I've seen no sign to think that their AV is doing anything but trying to be a good AV. Kaspersky, what I have seen him do is publicly use his security position as a respected security expert to support government policy. So like the government will say we need to control social media for social stability reasons, and he'll say we need to control it for security reasons. So he'll do things like that. I have seen him do. And I mean, they have government contracts there, including multiple security contracts. So there is that aspect of it. And then sometimes they do report on cyberespionage cases, but a lot of the ones that are coming from Russia, they're not as aggressive in their reporting as some other places. But
I think October was like one of the first ones that actually.
Well, yeah, they talked about Boros, for example, like there is not actual verifiable proof that came from Russia, but it was written on the time zone that's Russian, and there's some stuff inside that suggests that it came from Russia. Oh, sorry, it's the Moscow time zone, and there's Russian language, things like that, which some people would consider is proof that it's Russian. But there's nothing in there that's like, I made this, Colonel Ipateyev or something like written in the code. And so while some other people were very quick to, like BAE was very quick to be like, oh yeah, it's Russia. Kaspersky was like, well, that's not actually proof. And technically that's true, but there's sort of like the British American company was very happy to blame Russia, and the Russian company was less happy. There's like these political implications to what that really means. But the people I've worked with are like, very serious about their jobs and not spies, and I actually really like them. So, yes?
You mentioned like hacktivism that happens with politics, with the DDoS carried out and all that. And I was wondering, what was the organizing aspect of it? Because from what I understand, attack environment is that a lot of computers learn how to join the attack. Hacktivists get involved and participate in it. So like what's the motivation?
You can volunteer, and there are volunteer efforts around the world. There's actually some in Russia with those exploding the house, and they target the Kremlin and stuff. But it's the home, the better translation. But this particular case, they weren't doing that. Most botnets are not. When those attacks are called, they're called diffused DDoS attacks. So it's a diffuse distributed DDoS attack, because they're each individual volunteers participating. When a botnet does it, it's a network of infected computers or servers that someone is controlling from a central point. Most of the time, these computers, they're just individuals who are infected. They have no idea that all their spare bandwidth in the background is being used by cyber criminals. They also don't know, like, people host their criminal information on these computers, things like that. They have no idea anything is happening in the background while they're just, watching YouTube videos. And so in that case, you just need one person. It's typically a criminal who has these networks. Just order all the computers to launch the attack. Now, in terms of their motivation, they could be patriotic. There are criminals who are also patriotic. They could be hired. Just today we'll attack this hardware site, tomorrow we'll attack NATO, whatever. Or they could be ordered, or they could be a government-owned botnet. However, this has been floated. Does Russia have state botnets? I would guess no. And the few people I've talked about it in Russia, I would guess no, because first of all, that requires the capability, and it's hugely risky when you have all these botnets right there that you could get at any time that you wanted fairly easily. I mean, back to the Georgia case, those were criminal botnets the week before. So, I mean, the motivation of the actual attacker may have been patriotism, may have been money, or it may have been fear. It depends. Okay.
All right, well, we're just about out of time. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Water. Water.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.